that time, the Michigan Opera Theater came knocking on my door and actually had a position for Michigan Opera, Dayton Opera, and Opera Pacific to work for all three companies. While I was at Michigan Opera, actually one night, David D. Cara, who was the founder, called me and said, "Hey, there's this big foundation grant that's coming up, that's due. And guess what? We have no one to really write it, and it's for arts education," which was the area that I was in. I was in the education department. And he said, "Hey, it's due in 3 days. Do you think you can write it? It's to the Kresge Foundation." And if you don't know the Kresge Foundation, it's one of the largest foundations nationally, but it sits here in Detroit. And so I wrote that grant, and my first grant was just short of $1 million, and I thought, wow, I actually got that grant. It was awarded. David called me and was so happy that it was awarded. And I thought, hey, that wasn't bad. I can do that. Well, the thing that I didn't realize were really the years and years of relationships that David had built with that foundation. I got to know a little bit more about development work and what it really meant, because development is not what most people think it is. It's really about developing relationships and serving as a steward to a mission. And you got to be really passionate, have a lot of passion for that mission and commitment to the mission. And so the symphony called me back actually for a full-time job to work as their associate director of corporate and foundation relations. Corporations and foundations do this work in a very different way. I will say foundations in particular are really looking at a very specific mission driven by their board of trustees, right? And that board of trustees is trying to change the world or touch the world in some very significant manner. I really worked toward foundation giving a lot in the beginning, because I felt like foundations really existed purely for that purpose. I learned as I got older that wasn't really the case. There's a lot of politics in foundation giving that drives where they're going. Their global touch and reach is very hard to understand how it's driving that mission and changing it. And so you have to really be on top of why those changes are being made and who's driving those changes, so you can get to the correct person in a foundation. Now at the university, one of the first things I did when I came here was I took 6 months to meet all of our foundation donors and ask them how Wayne State could be a better partner, and what unique, well, 3 questions: how Wayne State could be a better partner, what unique role Wayne State plays in our community, our state, nationally, globally, from their eyes, and then 3 is how we fit their mission. Like, what are our common goals, right? And it was very, very interesting to hear from each of those foundations. And that's what you got to really do. You got to come from where the person or the foundation, people think of these big corporate structures and big foundation structures. You're not talking to, let's say, General Motors. I'm talking to a person at General Motors. And so you need to be thinking, when you're talking to someone, they drive something at that corporation or foundation, and it comes from a very personal spot. And so when I'm talking to someone or I'm collaborating with somebody, you'll hear me use words like my partners, my team members. I don't say I rarely will say corporate donors. I normally say corporate partners, because it's much bigger than just a donation. They want to have an impact that will change lives and change the university or change the city of Detroit or change the state of Michigan, So
is there a distinction that you would like to make in the difference between foundation and corporate?
Yes. So approach to corporate, what I would say about corporate giving. So there's different areas of corporate giving. There's corporate philanthropy, there's corporate sponsorships. These are different people in the corporate corporations who handle giving and think about it in very different ways. I will say that the distinction for corporations is, don't be fooled. Corporations have to make money. And I say that and people sometimes laugh, but many many of our faculty, many people, when they're approaching corporations, think of them much like a foundation where it's completely philanthropic. Even if the corporation has a philanthropy arm, it's never completely philanthropic. They have a goal, and if you look at most corporations, their philanthropic giving is aligned with the mission of the corporation or the corporate business. So, for instance, if you look at DTE Energy, they're ones that, they're good supporters of Wayne State University. They have many areas of giving, right? The arts, they give a lot of money to the Jazz Festival, to many of the performing arts throughout the city, the DIA. I mean, so they're pretty broad in how they support the arts, and they support many other areas as well. Part of the reason for that is that they recognize that many people come to the arts. And so it gives them a visibility as a good steward to the city of Detroit and the region because they are caring for the arts, but it's also who they're connected with. So if you look at the boards of directors of these performing and visual arts organizations, what you will recognize if you map it out, and we do, by the way, I have a researcher on staff who pays attention to all of this, is that you can look at and draw a correlation between those top boards and the top performing arts groups. So if you're trying to get to a table and say, we care about something, or we want to work on something, or we want your business as a corporation, it starts as an individual. So you're going to want to serve on a board or participate in some way with an organization that person is passionate about. So whether it be the zoo or the arts or whatever it is, you want one of your people from DTE to be sitting next to somebody else who is a major, corporate, future, client, or somebody who you might want to get in front of. And so there's a lot of those types of connections. Corporations, again, do have philanthropy, which is a little bit closer to foundations, but not exactly, because they are mission driven with a business purpose, a very business purpose. The sponsorship teams are very, again, you get that's even farther away from philanthropy and often not seen as philanthropy, but very important. When they're doing sponsorships, there's metrics to those sponsorships. Everything from how many people, let's say, are coming to a performance and saw their brand. DTE, again, they're their brand masters. They always, exactly what they're going to want, right? Everything from the print font to the to how they show their logo when they're sponsoring something is really down to a fine point with their team, that it's exactly that way. And part of the reason is because at the end, they want to know that their return on investment for that sponsorship is equal to, let's say, if they're sponsoring, let's say, performances at the Hillberry, is equal to what they might get at the DSO, right? Well, we know they're not exactly the same, so we lean on our missions of what we're trying to accomplish and how we talk about that, and we make sure we're connected to people who are either Wayne State University alums who are at the top of the corporation, or we're connecting in other relationships so they can raise our profile to make us a little bit more balanced from, let's say, the DSO, who does, many more performances than perhaps we have at the Hillberry. So yes, very different. Foundations, when you think of foundations, and many people don't know this, is many of their, each of their program areas focus in very different areas. Each of those program areas have program officers who often come from academia. So you think of the foundations as they find subject matter experts for each of those core areas and try to find the best. If they're a global foundation like the Ford Foundation in New York, not to be confused with Ford Motor Company Fund, but the Ford Foundation in New York, if you look at each of those areas, they've brought people in globally who are subject matter experts to, again, have a systemic and sustained change globally on whatever that topic is, right? So when you're talking to those folks, if you look at my team who works in foundation relations, they are polar opposite of my corporate relations team. My corporate relations teams go into many events, trying to connect up with people, trying to build those relationships in that way. It requires a lot of time going out and actually being present, right? So you show up and you're there, right? That's the first thing. Get invited to the party, right? So if you can get invited to the party and you can get into the room, then you get in front of that person and you get a separate, meeting with them, to get a cup of coffee, and you start building the relationship, right? It's just like you would for an audition, or you're trying to get to an agent or something of the sort. It's that same sort of way that you work through it, right? But my foundation team are much more like researchers. Those program officers are hard to get to. You normally have to do something very formal and stuff to get to them. So you might have to go to a conference or a symposium where they might be speaking and see if you can connect in that way. You might need an introduction from another colleague. Sometimes they won't even take your call in advance, so you have to send a well-crafted and thoughtful email, or do several letters of intent before you even get their attention. It matters what university you're coming from. So there's all sorts of, they're very different in the way in which they work. And depending on how you work and like to work, those two areas are great career choices, but you got to make sure you get into the right one. It's rare that you're kind of like me, that you sit in between the two. So you might want to think about that.